Good morning, everybody. I don't know if anybody knows the story of this backdrop, but these are blankets that are going to go after the event today to Haven for Hope for distribution to the homeless, and I find that beautiful. And when I saw this backdrop and how beautiful it was, it made me feel better about coming out here to talk to you. When I was young, my great-grandfather, an immigrant from Scotland, who served as a medic in World War I and worked his whole life as a gardener in the outdoors, told me something I'll never forget. He said, "Bob," he used to call me Bob, "there's just one way to walk in the woods. Do you know what that is?" And I said, "No, grandfather, I don't know." He said, "Slowly." And that stuck with me all these years. And I think it was for my grandfather, knew something that it's taken me a number of years to start to discover for myself. More than a reverence for nature, I think for my grandfather, a man who had spent his life with his hands in the dirt, it was about a relationship with nature that spoke to him. So as a child, I grew up loving art, and I also loved nature. And I think that's why I became an architect, because it allowed me to work with both. And I've been dealing with this in my career through endeavoring to find a sustainable architecture that connects people to the land and to themselves. A friend of mine wrote recently a quote that I found compelling, and it got me interested in this idea. It's about love and beauty. And of course, love is a very strong word. It's one of the strongest words in the human language. And beauty is one of those words that's very hard to define. But Lance is talking about both in conjunction and relationship to the built environment. And he says we don't love things because they're non-toxic and biodegradable. We love them because they move the head and the heart. And I think what Lance is saying speaks to a lot of us that have been trying to find solutions in the modern world to our ecological problems. And though we've made a lot of technological advances, especially as of late, we have many technologies and much progress in the area of finding more ecologically sensitive and sustainable solutions in the built environment. Many of us don't feel like we have quite reached the potential and the place that we need to be until we can speak to people's heads and their hearts more fully. So where should we start with that? I believe that the roots of beauty run deepest in nature, and that's my departure point. And this is where I live, and this is where many of you live, the Texas Hill Country. It's a place of undeniable beauty. It's the place where busy urbanites all over this country, but especially in Texas, crave to come and retire. But why do these types of places appeal so strongly? Well, E.O. Wilson argues in his book Biophilia that each human being has an innate desire to connect to the processes, patterns, and systems of nature. It's a biological and genetic pre-programming of every person. Now, all mobile species have a way of defining and creating and identifying their own habitat. It's an innate part of who they are. Why would humans be any different? In fact, the best evidence suggests that while humans have only been living in the post-agricultural world, the modern world of communities like we know them today for the last 5,000 years, they have spent literally tens and thousands of years adapting, evolving, and thriving in environments very similar to this, on the plains of Africa and the savanna before moving to Europe and Asia. So it's not just that we appreciate nature for its beauty on the surface, but we understand it in a deeply subconscious way that's really part of our DNA. It's who we are. We are nature, and nature is us. Now, recently, a number of people, not recently actually, over the last 20 to 30 years, there's been a number of folks that have been looking into this more deeply. In addition to Wilson, there's people like British geographer J. Appleton, architect and educator Grant Hildebrand, ecologist Stephen Keller. And these folks have started to develop a language by which we can start to put into words those things that are held within our spirit, within our hearts. And one of the first combination of words that they start to put together have to do with this evolved human-nature relationship. It's the idea that humans react to complexity and order. That's how we make sense of the world. It's how we understand the patterns that you see within this picture. It's how we understand scale and texture. light and shadow, contrast. It's one of the most elemental tests of human development. And it's essential to our survival, and it's essential to our sense of well-being. When we're in environments like this, we can't help but start to read them, even if subconsciously. Now, the second really important part of this is the idea of seeking out of refuge and prospect. That's the balance of shelter and security balanced against opportunity. It's the idea that we're seeking out an edge, a place where we can see but not be seen. This environment provides that. In the shade of these trees that you see in this typical hill country scene, I can be concealed, yet I can see the horizon, and I can see the prospect and opportunity before me while feeling secure. Now, you may intuitively employ the elements of prospect and refuge when you select your seat at a restaurant. I know I do. It's a really powerful way of thinking about the world. Now, what if we could understand this even more deeply? When you think about biological history and years ago, the early humans would have seen the woodland and certainly the forest as perhaps a dark and foreboding place. You add water and the dappling of light, and the complexity ramps up. It becomes more intriguing. Okay? This is where the element of enticement comes in, and it's a very powerful element within our relationship to nature. Have you ever noticed that when you're walking in the forest and you see a dappling of light in the distance that signifies a clearing, how you're drawn to it? That's what's happening here. And when you bundle enticement up with an element of peril, and this is a funny one, but when we talk about peril, what I'm trying to suggest here is that human species has been rewarded throughout millennia for its willingness to test boundaries, to move beyond their limits, to make sacrifices and to do scary things, to have a sense of adventure. So those together also become very powerful elements of the human-nature relationship. This is the Blue Hole in the Texas Hill Country. This is one of many blue holes in Texas, and I'm sure many blue holes across the country. This is a place where my children can go and play for hours, learning to read the environment, testing their boundaries, and becoming who they are. Now, I bet many of you are like me, and you have places like this from your childhood memories that no longer exist. And the simple fact is that more and more every year, we're being forced to live within environment and nature and beauty-deprived environments. Can we find those again? Can we build a little bit of nature's beauty into the worlds that we make, in which we habitate, in which our communities thrive? This has been happening for thousands of years. You can see here from the beautiful example of the cathedrals in Europe. It's through the ornament and exact replication of the natural elements that people crave to associate themselves with that we see as being portrayed as the elements of beauty. And those are still the elements of beauty today. They're based on people's understanding of their natural world and the structures that underpin everything around them. In places that we hold up as the most beautiful places that we've ever been, in this case, the Alhambra in Spain, we see all the elements of complexity and order, prospect and refuge, water and the dappling of light. You can see the delicate lacework of the foliage mimicked above these colonnade that feels like a woodland edge. The water, the light-filled courtyard, the sense of prospect and refuge, and those elements that we crave as satisfying human environments. Now, in more recent days, we've seen architects and artists that have taken a slightly different approach. They've boldly pushed beyond the direct representation of nature and moved towards a more abstract representation of nature that nonetheless speaks deeply to our hearts and to our minds. This is Frank Lloyd Wright's Taliesin. And you can see this is a refuge-oriented environment. There's prospect, there's enticement, there's the elements of the other things that I mentioned, but it's very strongly refuge. Frank Lloyd Wright was the victim of a tragic fire and lost many loved ones within this home that he rebuilt. And when he rebuilt this home, he spoke to what he needed in his inner spirit, in his heart, which was refuge. And this was the result. Now, I use him as an example of one of the earliest modern architects that understood intuitively this idea of connecting to the place and to nature. He was trained in the formal arts of architecture, yet he rejected those things to seek out something that was more fundamental. This is Juliet's Juliets Tower from about the 1890s. You can see not just prospect and refuge, but that element of enticement and peril that are very strong. If you were to see this tower, you would be hardly able to resist the enticement of going up to this perch in concealed fashion and looking out over the landscape. It really speaks to something deep inside. In fact, we're still doing this today. An example from Marlin Blackwell, which is a tower that does almost exactly the same thing that Frank Lloyd Wright was doing in the 1890s. It adds a certain complexity and order. In this case, the craft that only humans can bring to their world. This idea of rhythm and beauty bundled up with a little peril. These are powerful motivators, or else why would we build these things? Again, this isn't something that you have to understand. This is something you should just feel. Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water in Pennsylvania. He's speaking to the underlying structure of nature itself and creating a rhythm and a balance that's pleasing to people. Using the materials of the place. Here he's actually looking at the stone ledges of the creek bed and mimicking that in his architecture to create a place that had a certain fit. And again, how could you resist the idea of coming down to this man-made platform and touching that little bit of nature? The reflected light, the movement of water, it all contributes to a place that feeds the spirit and speaks to the heart. The refuge of a bedroom. It's concealed and protected, secure. Yet notice the element of the floor-to-ceiling glass. It creates the illusion that the space extends to the outdoors. The element of prospect is very strong, even in the strongest refuge spaces like this one. The idea of light in spaces where you may not have a view of the outdoors, but you have an understanding of the changing of the time of day, the changing of the seasons and the weather. Even that speaks to our spirits. And in a place like Johnson Wax Building, which has been home to Johnson Wax employees for almost 100 years, and has actually seen generations of employees living within this space, has always been satisfying to them because of the biophilic, nature-oriented solutions that Frank Lloyd Wright intuitively brought to the table. Rudolph Schindler in California and Hollywood. Again, all the same elements: prospect, refuge, enticement, but especially enticement. This little light inside the doorway is our dappling of light in the woods, and it draws us in, and it creates an experience with our environment that is about motion and movement and about a visceral connection to the place. Now, Schindler had a particularly elevated sense of how to accomplish this type of thing within the built environment. But when you look at what he was doing, you realize that he only came to this because of looking at the architecture of the East. So you see that in Japan, they've been building structures just like this, connected to the outdoor world, and responding to their own natural places in ways that were uniquely their own. But I think it suggests that these traits and these yearnings are actually universal. We've talked about architecture, we've talked about those built things, but what about the more ephemeral? Why do we place these things on the tables near our ailing loved ones? Why do we place them at the dinner table? We don't eat them, at least not normally. But could it be that they speak to the idea of an improving climatic conditions, opportunity, and plenty? Why can we sit mesmerized for hours staring into the flames of a fire? We build these fires even when it's not cold. Last weekend with the little cold snap, my family couldn't wait to build a fire. Barely dipped below into the 50s and we're building a fire. It speaks to something deep inside. And then when you look at art, and you look at reflection and shimmering light, you look at what humans can uniquely bring to the natural world, that combination, that place where nature meets human nature, and it becomes evident in our desire to order, to frame, and to reflect the beauty that we see around us. So if you believe, like I do, that nature exists in the intersection between the natural and man-made worlds, then you might conclude that Lance was right, that beauty is an environmental imperative. Thank you very much.